Have you ever experienced something like this? To be given an ultimatum by your own son. You can either serve my wife, or you can leave this house. Mom, it's your choice. My name is Evelyn Peterson. I am 76 years old. I am a mother who raised 3 children, who dedicated her entire life to protecting her family. I always believed my golden years would be peaceful, spent surrounded by the sounds of my grandchildren's laughter and the greenery of a garden. But the day I heard those words, I silently picked up my suitcase and quietly walked away from the house I once believed was my safe harbor. And then, 3 weeks later, an envelope arrived at their home from the family court. I was no longer just a guest living on their charity. I am the mother who, by leaving in silence, taught this generation a lesson about a person's dignity. In a world where respect for your elders is often treated like a luxury, this is my story. My name is Evelyn Peterson, 76 years old. And perhaps, it is a story that you too may one day need to hear. My name is Evelyn Peterson. I turned 76 this year. At my age, people often say, all you need to be happy is to live a quiet life, surrounded by your children and grandchildren. But for me, life has never been quiet, not even in these days that people call my twilight years. I was once a wife, a mother, and a homemaker. For nearly 40 years after I married, the stove, the vacuum cleaner, and the dinner table, those 3 things were my entire world. I knew nothing of finances. I had no time to think of myself. I simply lived for my family. I married at 22, and my life can be summed up in 3 words: sacrifice, patience, and silence. My husband, Robert, was a truck driver, a quiet, stubborn man. But he never once let his family go hungry. He never spoke words of love, but every month he handed me his entire paycheck, keeping only a few dollars for himself. That was the kind of man he was. I never asked for much, just to see my family gathered around the dinner table in the evening, to hear the sound of my children's laughter. That sight alone was enough to make me happy. We had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. We raised them with very little, but I always taught them, mind your manners and live your life with a grateful heart. I didn't have much of an education, but I believe that compassion and honesty have nothing to do with a college degree. When I was 59, on a rainy night, Robert collapsed during a long haul, and he never came home. He left without a word, so suddenly, on the day of the funeral, I stood in the snow-covered cemetery, clutching his photograph. My heart was empty. The children were grown, with lives of their own. After the funeral, they all went back to their cities. I was left behind, to begin a life alone in our old wooden house in Maine. Was once our home, but now, the only sound was the wind whistling through the cracks in the old roof shingles. Those years, they were an endless stretch of loneliness and memories. Every morning I'd make breakfast for one, listen to the news on the radio, and then tend to the garden. I silently cared for the flowers Robert had loved. At night, I would stare at the empty chair across the dinner table, and the tears would not stop. But I held no resentment. I just thought, as long as I'm alive, I will take care of this house. And so I lived, quietly, for nearly 10 years. But when I turned 68, my body began to fail me. My vision grew blurry, my hands started to tremble, and my feet were unsteady. One day, I fell in the kitchen and had to be hospitalized for 3 days. That's when my eldest son, Michael, who lived near Boston, called me. Mom, it's not safe for you to be living alone anymore. Come live with us. While I hesitated, he added, Sarah is on board with it too. Don't worry, just pack your things. Hearing those words, tears just streamed down my face. I thought, the day has finally come. I could say goodbye to the lonely, snowy days. I pictured a new life, playing with my granddaughter, gardening with my daughter-in-law, taking evening walks in the park, hand in hand. My heart soared at the thought. I packed my things at once, just one old suitcase. Inside, I put a few sets of clothes, Robert's photograph, and my favorite cookbook. With only that, I began the long 8-hour bus ride from Maine to Massachusetts. When I stepped off the bus, Michael was there, waving. Beside him stood his wife, Sarah, and my granddaughter, Lily. I smiled, a true, heartfelt smile, and waved back. In that moment, I was truly happy. I had no idea that this was the start of a new chapter in my life. A chapter where I would not be a mother, but an unpaid housekeeper. And that just a few months later, I would walk out of that house of my own accord, carrying only one thing with me, my pride. I moved into my son's house at the beginning of spring. It was a 3-story house in a quiet suburban neighborhood outside Boston. There was a small garden in the backyard, and my room was at the back of the second floor. The moment I walked in, I made a silent promise to myself. I will cherish this home. I'll keep it clean. I'll cook delicious meals. I will do everything I can to make sure we all live together happily, with smiles on our faces. The first few days were peaceful. I'd wake up early to make breakfast, take my granddaughter to preschool, and then clean the house. In the afternoon, I'd go grocery shopping and start preparing dinner. I'd set the table, make tea, and wait for my son to come home from work. That was my daily routine. I thought to myself, if I can live with my child and grandchild like this, and be of some help, that's more than enough. This isn't hard at all. But, after only a week, I began to feel a sense of unease. At every meal, I was the last one to sit down. I would set the table, and while the 3 of them sat, I would be in the kitchen, checking the soup, clearing a dish, or pouring drinks. By the time I finally took my seat, they were nearly finished eating. My daughter-in-law Sarah never said a word to me. She would clear only her husband's and her child's plates. As for my portion, it was just the leftovers, scraped together onto a single dish. I didn't get angry. I told myself, well, I'm the eldest here. It's fine if I eat later. But there was also a problem with my room. The small room they gave me was next to a storage closet, and it didn't have a lock. At first, I thought, it's just family, so we don't need locks. But one day, while I was changing, and another time while I was taking a nap, Sarah would just open the door and walk in without knocking. I said quietly, "It would be nice if you could knock next time." Without a smile, she replied flatly, "This is a spare room, Evelyn. I was just getting something." I fell silent. My heart sank a little, but again, I told myself, I'm a guest in their home. I shouldn't sweat the small stuff. However, as time went on, what had started as helping out slowly turned into my duty. My daughter-in-law, Sarah, had a routine. Nearly every day, she would leave little notes for me on the kitchen counter, or she would call me from her office with a list of instructions. "Mom, I need you to take care of this laundry, please. Money. The living room needs to be vacuumed and the windows washed. And while you're at it, please clean the upstairs bathroom too. No will. Lily has a little cough today, so you'll need to watch her. I have to get to work." I never uttered a word of complaint. I simply nodded and did as I was told. But as the days turned into weeks, the list of chores grew longer and longer, and my body began to protest. The work was constant, and I was starting to feel the strain in my bones, a deep weariness that sleep could no longer cure. I cooked 3 meals a day. I did the grocery shopping. I washed and folded the clothes. I looked after my granddaughter. I moved from one task to the next without a moment's rest, a constant, silent motion in the background of their lives. But in all that time, not a single person ever said, "Thank you." Not once. Then, one rainy afternoon, I felt a familiar chill creep into my body. I had caught a cold. A low-grade fever left me feeling weak and dizzy. I went to my room, placed a cool, damp cloth on my forehead, and tried to rest. I had just closed my eyes when the door swung open, and Sarah walked in without knocking. "Mom, Lily feels a little warm," she said, her voice sharp and impatient. "Could you make her some chicken and rice soup?" I opened my eyes, the effort making my head swim. I spoke slowly, my voice barely a whisper. "I have a bit of a fever myself, dear. Could I just rest for a little while?" Sarah's brow furrowed in annoyance. Her response was as cold and sharp as the winter wind. Lily comes first. Mom, it won't take long. Please, just get it done. There was no room for discussion. I pushed myself up, my body trembling with the effort. I held onto the wall for support as I made my way to the kitchen, my hands shaking so much I could barely grip the pot. By the time I had finished making the soup, the world was spinning around me. I stumbled back to my room, collapsed onto my bed, and pulled a single, thin blanket over my shivering body. I sipped lukewarm water from a glass by my bed, trying to bring the fever down on my own. As I lay there, alone in the quiet room, a question formed in my mind, a question that echoed in the deepest part of my heart. What am I in this house? Am I a mother, or am I just the help? The next day, feeling a little stronger, I quietly picked up the phone and called an old friend of mine, Susan. We had been neighbors for years back in Maine, and she now lived just outside of Boston. We hadn't seen each other in far too long. Let's meet downtown this weekend, she said, her voice warm and cheerful. For the first time in months, I felt a ray of sunshine break through the clouds in my heart. The thought of getting out of the house, of breathing fresh air and speaking freely with a friend, it was something to look forward to, a small island of hope in a sea of endless chores. That evening, I found Sarah in the living room, scrolling through her phone. I approached her hesitantly, my voice soft. Sarah, would it be all right if I went out this weekend? I'd like to meet an old friend in Boston. It's been so long since I've seen her. She didn't even look up from her screen. Her voice was flat, devoid of any warmth. You live here now. You understand the arrangement, don't you? You know who you're living off of. Her words felt like a vice tightening around my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs. I tried again, my voice pleading. I'll leave after lunch and be back before dinner. It would only be for a few hours. Please, couldn't I? This time, she put her phone down. She looked directly at me, her eyes cold and hard, and she spoke one final, chilling sentence. Mom, if you want to live here peacefully, you don't get in the family's way. You're much more helpful to us when you're here, doing the housework. In that single, brutal moment, everything became crystal clear. I was not a cherished mother. I was not family. I was a lodger, an unpaid servant who was given a bed and meals in exchange for quiet, unquestioning obedience. That was my place in this house. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, listening to the sound of the wind rattling the window pane. My mind drifted back to my little house in Maine. I remembered the freedom I had to go out when I pleased, to cook what I wanted, to have my words mean something. In that house, my voice was heard. But here, in this grand three-story house, I was an invisible woman. The warmth of a family was something to be earned, a conditional prize given only in exchange for my complete submission. This was not a home. It was a transaction. And I thought to myself, I cannot let this go on. I simply cannot. But at that moment, lying alone in the dark, I still didn't know what I was going to do. I only knew that somewhere deep inside me, something fundamental had begun to quietly break apart. May 12th. It was a Monday morning, with the first hint of summer hanging in the air. The Massachusetts sky was already bright with a strong early sun. As I did every morning, I woke at 5 o'clock and made my way to the kitchen. I put the kettle on to boil and began preparing breakfast. I hadn't slept well, and my body felt heavy with a deep, lingering exhaustion. But it was the start of a new week, and I forced myself to move, to focus on the tasks ahead. I was standing at the sink, washing the dishes from the night before, when I heard the sound of footsteps pounding down the stairs. It was Sarah. She stormed into the kitchen holding a sheaf of papers, her face set in a grim, determined expression. At first, I thought they might be bills or some kind of mail. But she pulled out a chair, spread a crisp, white piece of paper across the dining table, and said without any emotion, "This is the schedule I want you to follow for the week, Mom. Make sure you do everything on it." I raised my head and looked at the paper. At the top, in large, bold letters, were the words, Work Schedule, May 12 teeths, May teeth stracks. Below that was a list of 14 detailed instructions, each with a specific time or day assigned to it. 2. Prepare breakfast, 5003 a.m. Daily, take Lily to school, 7:15 a.m. Daily C, clean living room and downstairs bathroom. Daily CCC. Laundry, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, grocery shopping. List. Provided prepare, lunch. 1 numbers. 11:0 a.m. Take out trash. On designated days, no exceptions. Pick up Lily from school. 4,000 p.m. 4,000 p.m. 5:30 p.m. Give Lily her bath. 6:0 p.m. Wash dishes. After every meal, clean toilets. Wednesday. Sunday, hang and fold laundry. On designated days, childcare for Lily. Whenever Sarah has errands, I read each line, my eyes tracing the cold black letters. A wave of dizziness washed over me, and my heart began to pound in my chest. It felt as if I were a new employee being handed a list of duties, a formal job description for a position I never applied for. I found my voice, but it was small and weak. Do I have to do all of this? Sarah didn't even bother to look at me. She answered coldly, "You're living in this house. It's the least you can do to carry your own weight." I gave a small, defeated nod. I folded the paper and placed it on the corner of the table. But inside, my world was in turmoil. I went back to my room and just sat on the edge of the bed, staring into space. There must be a misunderstanding, I told myself. If I talk to Michael, he'll understand. He'll make it right. I clung to that hope. That night, at the dinner table, I tried to speak to him. "Michael, about that paper Sarah gave me this morning, my son was busy on his laptop." He didn't look up as he replied, "Yeah, just follow what it says. It'll be easier for everyone." I was silent for a few seconds, gathering my courage. I spoke again, my voice trembling slightly. "But Michael, I'm getting older. Some days, it's a little too much for me physically." He cut me off. He snapped his laptop shut, and his voice was as cold as his wife's had been. "Mom, this isn't a resort. If you can't handle it, then you're free to leave." I couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. For a moment, it felt as though my heart had stopped beating. The man sitting in front of me, was this the same little boy who had clung to me with his small hands when he was sick with a fever? The same boy who had come home from school crying after being bullied? But now, when he looked at me, his eyes saw only a burden, a freeloader. I didn't cry. I simply smiled. It was a quiet smile that no one else noticed. But inside, I heard the sound of something shattering into a million tiny pieces. That night, I didn't sleep. I went about my duties as usual. I washed the dishes, wiped down the floors, and put the house in order, moving silently through the darkened rooms. Then, late in the night, after the rest of the family was asleep, I went to my room. I opened the small wooden dresser and pulled out the old suitcase I had brought with me from Maine. The baggage tag from the bus ride was still attached to the handle. I folded a few simple changes of clothes. I took the framed photograph of my late husband, Robert, and I packed the old, worn notebook where I had written down my children's favorite recipes when they were young. I didn't take much. I didn't have much to take. The woman I was now was alone. The next morning, at 5:30, I walked out of the house. No one saw me leave. There was no one to say goodbye. On the dining room table, next to my key, I left the work schedule folded neatly in 4. On it, I had written a single, short sentence. I am leaving. Not because I can't do the work, but because I will not be disrespected. I called a taxi and waited on the curb. As the car pulled away, I glanced back one last time. That house, the place where I had hoped to find my final peace, stood silent and cold in the morning light. Inside the taxi, I clutched the handle of my old suitcase, gripping it so tightly my knuckles turned white. The driver turned his head slightly. "Where to, ma'am?" he asked. I answered in a voice that was barely a whisper. "South Station, please." The car pulled away from the curb, and as we moved down the street, the familiar neighborhood began to slide past my window. I had walked these sidewalks so many times before. I remembered the day I held my granddaughter Lily's hand as we walked to the little park down the block. I remembered the afternoon at the start of summer when I bought her a vanilla ice cream cone from the corner store. All those memories. They felt like a soft mist, so close I could almost touch them, yet impossibly far away. They were heartbreaking and beautiful, all at once. I did not cry, but inside my chest, a vast, hollow space had opened up. An emptiness unlike anything I had ever felt before. It was as if I had left a piece of my own heart behind in that house. A part of my soul was still there. There was no anger. I held no resentment. I was just tired, so profoundly tired. I had spent my entire life enduring, protecting, and giving everything I had. And yet, in the end, all it earned me was to be seen as a burden in the eyes of the person I loved most. Suddenly, a memory from my younger years came flooding back. My mother-in-law, a quiet, stern woman, had once said something to me. An old woman is like a shadow, she'd told me. She appears only when she's needed, and she vanishes when she's not. At the time, I had rebelled against her words in my heart. That's not true, I thought. If you live a good life, if you give everything to your family, your children and grandchildren will cherish you when you're old. But now, I finally understood. An old woman doesn't just vanish. She is quietly, bit by bit, edged out of the picture. When the taxi arrived at South Station, I found a small diner tucked away on a side street and went inside. I ordered a bowl of hot chicken noodle soup. Like, it had been so long since I had eaten a meal slowly, without anyone rushing me, without having to watch anyone else's face to see if they needed something. I lifted the spoon to my lips, one slow mouthful at a time. Every drop of the hot, savory broth seemed to seep into the cold, empty space in my chest. The saltiness I tasted wasn't just from the soup. It might have been from the single tear that finally escaped and trickled down. From the corner of my eye, after I finished eating, I walked to a modest hotel nearby and checked into a simple room. It had nothing more than a small bed, plain white walls, and a window that looked out over a busy street filled with people. That was all. I had no idea how long I would stay here, but for tonight, just for tonight, I knew that no one would wake me. I wouldn't have to get up at dawn to stand in a kitchen for someone else. For this one night, I was not a lodger. Later that evening, I sat by the window and watched the headlights of the cars passing by below. In my hands, I held a tattered old notebook. It was the one where I had written down my son's favorite meals when he was just a little boy. Chicken noodle soup for when he was sick. Hot oatmeal with brown sugar for cold winter mornings. All-fried chicken for his 10th birthday. With every page I turned, the ink was a little more faded, the paper a little more yellowed and stained, but the memories themselves were as vivid as ever. A thought drifted into my mind. When did he forget about those meals we shared at our table? When did I stop being mom and become an inconvenience? There was no answer. But in that quiet moment, I made a decision. I would not let my story end like this. This wasn't about anger. It wasn't about revenge. It was about the fact that I, as a mother, as a human being, refused to finish my life being looked down upon. And so, tomorrow, I would act. I would go to City Hall. I would go to the kind of place where so many mothers like me suffer in silence, and I would make my own voice heard. I would choose my own path, the path to taking back my dignity. I am living now in a small hotel room near South Station. The room is barely 100 square feet, but it is enough. A single bed, a small desk, and a window with a little balcony that lets me see the city waking up in the morning. That is all I need. For the first 3 days, I hardly went outside at all. What I needed most was time to quietly sort through the tangled thoughts and feelings in my own heart. Each morning, I would go down to the little diner and order a warm bowl of oatmeal or toast with tea, and in the same notebook where I once wrote down recipes, I now began to write down a new list. The things I had to do next. It was a quiet preparation for what was to come. the careful process of cutting myself away from the place I had once called family. On the morning of the fourth day, I put on my old coat, slung a faded gray canvas bag over my shoulder, and made my way to the Suffolk County Courthouse. Strangely, there was no hesitation in my heart. In the past, I had always left paperwork and official business to my husband or my son. But today, I stood at the counter alone and I signed my own name. I took a number from the clerk at the records office and sat down to wait. When my number was called, I walked up to the window, presented my ID, and spoke in a clear, steady voice. I would like to file an affidavit of independence. I am formally severing my status as a dependent of my son, Michael Peterson. The woman behind the counter looked up at me, her expression one of surprise. She asked, Are you sure about this, ma'am? Once this is filed, you will be waiving any legal right to support from your family. I nodded quietly. Yes, I am no longer a part of that family. 30 minutes later, after I had filled out the forms, pressed my thumbprint where required, and signed my name, the clerk handed me a copy of the document. A bright red stamp was pressed firmly next to my signature. From that moment on, I was legally no longer a member of my son's household. The right to inheritance, the obligation of care, the heavy burden of those days when I was called mother, but treated like a maid, all of it was over. I walked out of the courthouse and stood for a moment in the middle of the bustling sidewalk. As people hurried past me, I felt something in the deepest part of my chest become astonishingly light. It was as if I had finally broken a set of invisible chains that had been squeezing my heart for years. The next day, I went to the bank where I had kept my life savings. I took a number and waited my turn. When I reached the teller's window, I said, I would like to donate the entire balance of my savings account, $240,000 to a charitable foundation. The teller looked up from his computer, his eyes wide with shock. The entire balance, ma'am? That's everything in the account. I slid my identification across the counter and answered him clearly. The beneficiary is already chosen. It is a fund that provides support for single mothers who have escaped abusive situations. My hand trembled slightly as I filled out the recipient's information, but there was no doubt in my mind. I had once planned to leave that money to my son and my granddaughter, something to help them in the future. But I understood now. Money is not a reward for a life without gratitude. I wanted that money to go to mothers who, like the woman I used to be, had suffered in silence, unable to speak up for themselves. I wanted it to be a first step for them, and for me, in reclaiming a life of dignity. After the transaction was complete, the bank manager asked me, Will you be notifying your family of this donation? I shook my head and said softly, Family? We're not family anymore. That afternoon, I visited a small law office that my old friend Susan had recommended. It was in a modest, older building, but the office itself was clean and impeccably organized. A female lawyer, perhaps in her mid-40s, greeted me. She was calm and spoke with a gentle respect. I explained my situation quietly. I want to formally terminate any legal or financial ties to my son. I wish to renounce any future claims to inheritance and waive any obligations of care. I want this documented legally so there can be no disputes later on. She looked at me intently for a moment before asking, Are you absolutely certain, Mrs. Britches Peterson? This will sever your relationship with your family completely. I offered her a small smile. That relationship? It was broken a long time ago. All we are doing now is putting it down on paper. Together, we drafted a formal notice. It was notarized, sealed in an envelope, and sent by certified mail to my son's house. The legal notice was clear, with no room for misinterpretation. Quietly, but with absolute certainty, I had formally let go of the role of mother. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't show any anger. I simply acted with resolve. For the next 3 weeks, I contacted no one. I canceled my old phone plan and got a new number. I made sure no one could find me. No one knew where I was. In their eyes, I imagine I was the mother who had vanished without reason, disappearing into thin air. But for me, it wasn't a disappearance. It was a rebirth. I am living now in a state of freedom, guided by my own sense of pride. And I believe with all my heart that sometimes silence is the most powerful voice of all. 3 weeks. 3 weeks of living quietly without telling a soul where I had gone. It was a life with no one calling me mom, with no sound of a child's cry, with no one handing me a schedule of cooking duties or piling obligations onto my shoulders. At first, I felt a small pang of loneliness, but as the days passed, I felt a strange and wonderful calm settling over my heart. It felt as though I had returned to my true self for the first time in decades. That was the feeling. Every morning, I took a walk in a small public garden near my hotel. I would see an elderly couple holding hands as they did their morning stretches, and a gentle smile would find its way to my lips. No one here knew me. No one told me, "You need to do this," or "You have to do that." I was no longer a person who existed to serve others. I was simply a person. And in that realization, I felt a profound sense of relief. One afternoon, I stopped by a small used bookstore near South Station. There, I picked up a book titled Health and Meditation in Your Senior Years. A young woman working behind the counter spoke to me in a kind, gentle voice. "Ma'am, please feel free to sit and read for as long as you like. No one's going to rush you out of here." I couldn't help but smile. It was just a small smile, but I felt a warmth spread from the deepest part of my heart. I was no longer someone who had to ask for permission to sit down, who had to feel like she was taking up space. In the evenings, I developed a new habit of writing in a journal. I didn't write about my frustrations or complaints. Instead, I quietly chronicled my journey. I left that house of my own free will. I chose freedom. And I refused to be looked down on. Just writing those words made my heart feel a little lighter. One day, I decided to visit the Women's Resource Center that I had previously donated to. The receptionist greeted me with a warm and welcoming smile. I didn't mention that I was a donor. I simply said, "I'd like to volunteer. If you have anything I can help with, even something small." The woman in charge thought for a moment, then her face brightened. "Every Friday we have a group of single mothers who come here for support. Would you be willing to teach them a cooking class?" I felt a warmth rise in my chest as I nodded. I had spent most of my life cooking for someone else, but this was different. I was choosing to cook. It wasn't an obligation. It was a choice that came from my heart. On that first Friday, 4 young mothers gathered in the community kitchen. I taught them how to make a hearty chicken and vegetable soup, and how to roast a chicken so the skin was perfectly crisp. One of the young women asked me, "Were you a professional chef before?" I laughed and shook my head. "No, dear. I was just a mother. I just spent a very long time cooking for my family." They all laughed, and I laughed with them. As steam rose from the pots on the stove and the sound of our shared laughter filled the kitchen, a thought came to me. I see now. This is it. My new life? It has just begun. That night, I wrote in my journal, "Not everyone will understand the value of a mother. But that's all right. I understand my own value. And I will never let anyone look down on me again." R12. 3 weeks since I disappeared from that house, and I do not have a single regret. I no longer think of the cold dinners, the stinging glares, or that awful work schedule. What I think about now is tomorrow. Tomorrow is the day that the legal documents, the official notice, will arrive at the home of the family that once called me mother. Hello. They will be shocked. They will be upset, confused. But I am not sending it to hurt anyone. I only wanted to send them a message. The mother who once endured everything in silence will be silent no more. 3 weeks had passed since I walked out of that house, pulling my old suitcase behind me and quietly turned my back for the last time. In all that time, I had contacted no one. My phone was off. I had severed every connection. I was alive. But I was living in a different way. A life that was free, quiet, and unbound by the selfish expectations that others called responsibility. And then the day finally came. I remember it clearly. It was the morning of the 22nd day since I had left. The law office called. The legal documents addressed to your son have been successfully delivered. In their hands was a single, thick, white envelope. There were no decorations, no return address visible, just the recipient's name, printed in stark black ink. Mr. Michael Peterson, personal and confidential. Inside that envelope was a set of notarized legal documents, and tucked within them was a single letter, written carefully in my own hand. My hand did not shake. My heart did not waver. I wrote each and every word with a calm and steady mind. I will share a part of that letter with you. Michael, I lived in your home for 8 months. During that time, I came to a clear and painful realization. The act of bearing children, of raising them, of dedicating one's life to them, is no guarantee of being loved in return. I was wrong to believe that my final years would be spent living peacefully, with my child and grandchild. You did not treat me as family. You treated me as a burden, as someone whose only purpose was to serve. And so, I have made my decision. 2. Effective immediately, I am renouncing my relationship with you and your family. All ties are hereby severed. My life savings of $240,000 have been donated in full to a foundation that supports single mothers escaping abusive homes. I will never, under any circumstances, return to that house. You once gave me a choice. You said to me, you can either serve or you can leave. And Ben, the choice I made was to respect myself. Evelyn Peterson. A few hours after the envelope was delivered, my new cell phone began to vibrate over and over again. First, it was my son's number. I recognized it immediately, but I did not answer. Next, my daughter-in-law, Sarah. Then, my sister Clara, calling all the way from Vermont. After that, it was old neighbors from my town back in Maine. I understood at once. The ripple effects of that envelope had spread far beyond the walls of their house. That evening, I received a call from my lawyer. Your son has been in contact, she said. He says he wants to meet with you, to talk things over. I asked my lawyer to relay a simple message for me. There is no need for explanations. Everything is perfectly clear. I have simply chosen a way of life where I will not be looked down upon. Later, I heard from an old acquaintance what had happened. She told me that the moment the envelope was opened, the house descended into chaos. Sarah burst into tears, crying, "Your mother is so cold!" While Michael, in a fit of rage, slammed the envelope down on the floor. He then apparently retreated to his home office and sat there, in silence, for several hours. The next day, they began to search for me. They called every hotel in and around Boston. They started questioning my friends and old neighbors. They even searched for me online. But no one knew where I was. I had checked into the hotel under an assumed name. I was using a mail forwarding service to a private box, and my new address was a secret I shared with no one. I did not run away. I simply, quietly withdrew from a world that had treated me as if I were invisible. I did nothing wrong. I just decided that I would no longer be silent. 3 days later, a letter arrived at the law office. The sender was my daughter-in-law, Sarah. The message was short, just 2 paragraphs. Evelyn, I am so sorry. I've been thinking a great deal, and I realize now how deeply I failed to understand you, how I failed to respect you. I am ashamed. Please take care of yourself. That is all I wish for. I took the letter and gently placed it inside a drawer in my small hotel desk. I felt no anger, not a flicker of it. But I did not write back. Because respect, you see, is not something that can be built on words of apology alone. It is built on actions, on understanding, on a change of heart that is proven over time. An apology is a beginning, perhaps, but it is not the destination. That night, I opened my journal and wrote, "There was a time when they called me a lodger, when they told me to know my place. But now, I am dependent on no one. My value is not determined by anyone else's judgment or convenience. I have finally, I have become the main character in my own life. I am sure they will continue to look for me. They will call old friends and distant relatives, piecing together a puzzle they never realized they were a part of. But I will not go back. The woman I used to be was a mother who lowered her head in silence, but the woman I am now is a mother who left quietly, but left behind a voice that could no longer be ignored. And I knew, deep in my bones, I knew with a certainty that settled in my heart like the calm before a great storm, that the real tidal wave was only just beginning to form. I never replied to Sarah's letter. I continued to maintain my silence in the days that followed. It wasn't an act of spite or bitterness. It wasn't about holding a grudge. I simply wanted them to face the consequences they themselves had created. I wanted them to sit with the reality they had built, a reality where excuses and shifting blame would no longer serve as a shield. And then, 3 days later, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, the first wave crashed. I was sitting in the reading room of a community center near my hotel, lost in a book about gardening in small spaces, when my phone buzzed. It was an old friend, Susan, and her voice was trembling with a frantic energy. "Evelyn, it's a disaster. Someone wrote about you online. The whole story. The old neighborhood is in an absolute uproar." For a single moment I froze. My hand, holding the book open, went perfectly still. But it wasn't surprise that I felt. It wasn't fear either. It was a sense of inevitability. Everything was simply happening a little faster than I had anticipated. I learned the full story later. The post had been written by a woman who lived a few houses down from Michael and Sarah. She was a young mother who ran a small, local blog about family and community life. She had seen me that morning, the morning I left, pulling my old suitcase down the quiet suburban street. We had made eye contact, and when she offered a small, questioning smile, I had only managed a weak nod in return. She must have sensed something was wrong. In her post, she had written, "There is a woman in our neighborhood, a 76-year-old mother. A woman who lost her husband too soon and raised 3 children all by herself. This morning, in her later years, she quietly left her son's home. The reason? Because she was being treated like an unpaid freeloader. Isn't it time for us to think more deeply about how we treat our parents? About how we value our elders? Don't we owe them more than this?" The article spread like wildfire. Within hours, it had been shared hundreds, then thousands of times. The comments section exploded with thousands of replies. Most were filled with anger and profound sadness, but most of all, they were filled with questions directed at the family. It didn't take long for online sleuths to piece together the details. Soon, my son's name, and his family's, was attached to the story. And at that point, the situation spun completely out of their control. Susan called me back with an update later that day. My son, Michael, a respected lecturer at a local university, had been inundated with criticism. The university itself had received a flood of emails and calls. In response, the administration had placed him on temporary administrative leave. They've asked him to clarify the facts regarding his family situation, Susan explained, her voice still shaky. The university, she said, was under pressure to respond. As I listened, I had a quiet moment of understanding. That white envelope, the legal notice I had sent, it wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of the truth. I felt no joy. There was no sense of triumph, no feeling that a weight had been lifted from my chest. I simply thought to myself that justice doesn't always come from a courtroom. Sometimes, it is born from the collective awakening of people's hearts. It is the quiet, powerful voice of a community deciding what is right and what is wrong. That night, after writing the final entry in my journal for the day, I whispered a thought into the quiet of my room. I am sure that by now, my son has finally learned. A mother has her limits. And when you cross that line, she will no longer be silent. After that blog post went viral, my son's family was swept into a vortex of chaos, like a small boat caught in a storm they couldn't possibly navigate. The reality they had worked so hard to conceal behind the closed doors of their 3-story house in the Boston suburbs was now spreading across the internet, a cold, sharp, and indelible wave of public opinion. I didn't seek out the details myself. I had no desire to watch their downfall. But the fallout, as reported to me by my concerned friend Susan, was far greater than I could have ever imagined. Just 2 days after the initial post, several online news outlets picked up the story. The headlines were stark and sensational. 76-year-old mother, forced into servitude, quietly walks away after serving shocking legal notice. She chose freedom over being a freeloader. The high price of filial neglect. The articles were shared across social media, and the story took on a life of its own. Dozens of emails and letters, Susan told me, were sent to the university where Michael worked. How can a man who shows no respect for his own mother be qualified to teach social ethics to our children? One anonymous student reportedly posted on a university forum. The digital walls were closing in. The result was inevitable. The university officially suspended Michael from his teaching duties and launched an internal investigation into the matter. That cold morning when he'd issued his ultimatum, that crisp white envelope, and the trust between a mother and son now shattered beyond repair. It was all leading to a conclusion they could never have foreseen. Meanwhile, my daughter-in-law Sarah made another attempt to reach me. Perhaps panicked by the silence that had met her first letter, she sent another. This one was much longer, filled with page after page of remorse. She wrote about the pressures of her job, the exhaustion of raising a child, and how she had lost her emotional balance. The letter ended with a desperate plea. "Evelyn, I am so sorry. Please, just once, could we meet? I need to talk to you." I read the letter and, just as I had with the first one, I placed it quietly in the drawer. I didn't tear it up. I didn't reply. I simply put it away. Because there are some wounds in this world that an apology cannot heal. There are some distances that words alone cannot bridge. I had already chosen a new life. I now live in a senior living community in a quiet town just outside the city. I am not here because I had nowhere else to go. I am here because I chose a place where I would never again be seen as a burden, where I would never again have to be a person who knows her place. I have a small, private room. My window looks out onto a beautiful garden filled with white chrysanthemums, which have always been my favorite. Every morning, I join my new friends for some light exercise. We cook meals together in the communal kitchen, we tend to the garden, and on Wednesday afternoons, we sing our hearts out at karaoke. In the evenings, we sit together and share stories from our past. We talk about our lives, our triumphs, our heartbreaks. But no one cares who used to do what kind of fortune someone has, or how many children they have. That's not what matters here. Everyone in this place understands a fundamental truth. At this age, the greatest happiness of all is simply the freedom to be yourself. One day, another resident, a lovely woman named Harriet, asked me, "Evelyn, what brought you here? Do you have family nearby?" I gave her a gentle smile and answered her honestly. "I came here not to serve, my dear. I came here to live." Everyone in our little circle smiled warmly, and no one asked any more questions. They understood. Not long ago, our community celebrated its first anniversary. The staff asked each of us to write a short message for a commemorative plaque, a thought about our lives and our later years. I wrote, "Old age is not an ending. It is a new beginning. A life lived with a dignity that requires no one's permission. I am not angry anymore. Anger is a chain that binds you to the past. I have cast off that chain. I have chosen freedom and tranquility instead." Sometimes, on a quiet evening, as the sun sets and paints the sky in shades of orange and purple, I do think of that house. But it's not with longing or regret. I think of it as the place that taught me my final, most important lesson. No one, not even your own child, has the right to treat their mother like a guest who has overstayed her welcome. I have no way of knowing what the future holds for my son and his wife. How they will choose to live their lives from this day forward, but I am certain that they, too, must have realized something profound. To lose your mother is not something that happens only through death. It can come as a quiet separation, a silent departure. And that kind of loss is a far more terrifying thing to endure. My life here, in this senior living community, is quiet. It is peaceful. But it is never, ever lonely. Here, I am not the elderly mother who you have to be careful around. Here, I am Evelyn, a person in my own right, an individual with a name and a history. People listen to me here. They respect what I have to say. And that alone, that simple act of being heard, has made my heart feel lighter than it has in years. Every Saturday afternoon, I attend our community's Story Circle. It's a time when we gather and share pieces of our lives. We talk about our wedding days, memories of faraway travels, and the small, quiet sorrows that we could never quite bring ourselves to share with our own children or grandchildren. One day, a gentleman named Mr. Anderson shared a story. It was the 4th of July, he began, a small, sad smile playing on his lips. My son was supposed to pick me up for the family barbecue, but I guess he forgot. He laughed as he said it, but his eyes held a deep and unmistakable loneliness. I listened quietly, letting his words settle in the room. And then, it was my turn to speak. I didn't say much. My story was brief. All I said was, I was the mother who was always the last one to sit down at the dinner table. And when I left my home, I carried nothing but a single old suitcase. But now, I live my life with no one giving me orders, with no one demanding anything of me. I am living for myself. The moment I finished, a hush fell over the room, and then one of the other residents began to clap, a soft, gentle applause. Evelyn, she said, her voice full of warmth. You are so incredibly brave. But in my heart, I thought, I'm not brave at all. I have no great courage. I lived in silence for so very long. And because of that, I have finally learned how to say no. Here in this community, I have been given small responsibilities too. Every Thursday, I lead a cooking class. I taught the group how to make a classic Maine-style poached cod. The gentle aroma of ginger fills the kitchen, followed by the bright scent of lemon and a hint of salt. A simple, comforting flavor. This is delicious. What's your secret? One of the women asked. I smiled and replied, there's only one secret, really. You have to think of the person you're cooking for, but you must also cherish the person who is doing the cooking. That's all there is to it. One afternoon, a young staff member named Renati came to speak with me. Evelyn, she asked gently, don't you ever get lonely being away from your family? Living all by yourself? I thought for a moment before answering her quietly. There are times when I feel lonely, yes. But being taken for granted, being treated as if you are invisible, that is a much greater pain. Now, just to be free of that feeling, that is more than enough for me. On rainy days, I like to sit by my window and write letters. They are letters that will never be mailed. I write them only for myself. They are addressed to the woman I once was, the woman who believed that obedience was her only option. And in those letters, I write, if my son should ever read this one day, I want him to know this. Your mother has forgiven you. But she will never return to a place where silence was the only thing she was ever allowed. I don't know what kind of future is waiting for me down the road, but I do know this. Even without that 3-story house in the Boston suburbs, even without that place where I was only called mother, I have not lost myself. And I have learned that growing old is not about bowing your head and making yourself smaller. It is a choice to live out your remaining days with a quiet and unshakable sense of pride. And that is a choice I have finally, after all these years, been able to make for myself. I am a mother who once lived her life in silence. I spent so many years believing I would be loved if I just endured enough. And then one day, I quietly chose to walk away from that house. I left to reclaim something precious, a treasure called dignity. Now, in my small room at this senior living community, whenever the morning sun streams through my window, I whisper the same words to myself. I am alive now. I am breathing freely, without needing anyone else's permission. In this new life, there is no dinner table surrounded by 3 generations. There is no one calling out, "Grandma," and there is no warm feeling of a small hand tucked into mine. But there are also no orders. There are no watchful eyes, monitoring my every move. There are no words that cut into my heart. None of that exists here. That day, I was presented with an ultimatum. You can either serve my wife, or you can leave this house. Mom, it's your choice. I simply smiled. I didn't give an answer. I just quietly picked up my suitcase and left the home I had helped build with my own hands. Today, I have no property, no assets to my name. I own nothing. All I have is a single old photograph. It's a picture from my wedding day of my husband and me. And I have a small notebook, a place where I can finally write down the words I was unable to speak for 50 years. In it, you will find entries like these: May 12th service or departure. I chose dignity and walked out. To a May 14th, ate alone at a little diner near Grand Central Terminal. I wonder how many years it's been. No one rushed me. No one interrupted me. I finished my entire meal in peace. Isk a May 20th. Donated my life savings $240,000 to a foundation that supports single mothers who have escaped abusive situations. You cannot buy a family with money. So, I chose to use it for women who are fighting to protect their own dignity. Each a May 30th. Signed the papers to formally sever my co-resident status and renounce my inheritance. I have cut all ties. I am not the silent mother. I am not a shadow in someone else's house. I am Evelyn, a person. My life now is simple, but every day is filled with meaning. Every Monday, I go to a painting class. My hands tremble now, but with every brushstroke, a memory from my past comes to life on the canvas. One day, I painted a picture of an open door leading to a field of wildflowers. I wrote a small caption underneath it. This door, I opened it myself. I didn't need anyone's permission. Occasionally, I receive letters from old acquaintances who were too harsh. You should have given your family another chance. You are so brave. You did something that most older people could never do. I don't write back to any of them. It's not because I am being cold. It's because my actions are the only answer that truly matters. One afternoon, Renati, the young nurse's aide, asked me a question. Evelyn, if you could go back in time, would you make the same choice? I smiled at her and said, I would leave again. But this time, I would walk out on my own terms before I was ever given an order. I would leave before my heart had a chance to grow cold. People often say, when you get old, you should live surrounded by your family. I don't disagree with that. But a life without respect is 100 times more lonely than a life of Hwosha, Arsa, solitude and freedom. Now, for the first time, I am finally taking care of myself. I eat what I like, I wear the clothes I want to wear, I sleep when I am tired, and when my heart is calm, I read a book. I am not living for anyone else anymore. I am living for me. I no longer need that house, because there was no love there. There was no respect. And if someone were to ask me now, Evelyn, do you feel like you've lost everything? This is what I would tell them. What I lost was never really mine to begin with. It was the false hope of being cherished and the illusion that children owe their parents' unconditional devotion. What I have gained is tranquility, independence, and a sense of dignity that no one can ever take away from me. To all of you listening to my story, if you are living a life where you feel you must obey because someone tells you, it's because you're old, or it's because we're the ones feeding you, please, never forget this. Respect is not something you earn with age. It is a fundamental right that belongs to every single human being. Do not wait for someone else to grant it to you. You must protect it with your own will. And if you are ever caught hesitating between service and freedom, between endurance and dignity, I will tell you what I did. I chose dignity. If you understand the weight of what it means to be a mother, please do not turn a blind eye to the hands that quietly supported that life for so long. This is so no one ever has to silently pack their suitcase, and so no 76-year-old mother is ever made to feel like a mere lodger.